Hello, and welcome to Hiking While Pagan at this year's Puget Sound Pagan Pride 2021. We are going to hear a presentation from Emily Carlin about the Pacific Northwest and how it's a wonderland for those that love the outdoors. Emily Carlin is a witch, writer, teacher, and mediator based in Seattle, Washington. She currently teaches one-on-one online and at in-person events on the West Coast. During her 20-plus years of practice, she has published articles on defensive magic, pop culture magic, Santa Muerte, general witchcraft, and more. For more information, you can find Emily's website at www.e-carlin.com, and I'll put that in the chat too. So without any further ado, Emily, please let us know what you have to say for us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is going to be, I hope, interactive workshop. We've got a relatively small group, so there's lots of time to ask any specific questions you have. But basically, I'm going to talk about two main things: the responsibilities we have as pagans and nature-based spiritual practitioners in hiking, camping, and other kind of outdoor recreation, and then all of our unique opportunities to use those wonderful recreational times to actually enhance our spirituality and magical practices. So the first part's going to be a little soapboxy, so bear with me. Going to be all the responsibilities that we have that are special and not special. But once we get off the soapbox, we will then get into the fun stuff. So just so you know. So the first kind of major point about playing outside when you're a pagan is being very aware that nature is sacred, and that as an earth-based spirituality practitioner, whatever flavor you are, our version of like going out to a lake and going on a boat is different than someone who's going out to party. You know, we are out in nature and we experience it differently and have a different point of view for what nature means to us. And for a lot of people, particularly as you're kind of getting into nature-based spirituality, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance between, you know, going hiking and camping as a kid and maybe, you know, hitting trees with sticks and chasing squirrels and the kind of thing that kids do very innocently. Things like making sure that you're using reusable forks and spoons when you're out at a picnic, you know, very simple things where we all play outside, you know, from childhood through adulthood. But as pagans, it means a little bit more to us, and we have to think about that a little bit more deeply. And sometimes there's a real kind of dichotomy between like our pagan spiritual time where we're like, we go outside, we do rituals, we are in the headspace of specifically appreciating and connecting with nature, as opposed to when we go out to play, where we're maybe not thinking about any of that stuff, and we're maybe not treating nature with the same reverence we would have in that other context. And, you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing because we all have to unplug and de-stress in our various ways, but this is our sacred space. Nature is our church. And so we want to make sure that we're respecting it as much as we can, not just during our ritual and special spiritual times, but also when we're going out to do outdoor recreation. So the first kind of underlying principle of that, where we have to kind of re-language how we think about nature. We all kind of, you know, in the United States and in most of the Western world, we are brought up with ideas of property ownership, land ownership. You know, we go to public parks and it's everybody's space. We go to state parks and we go to national parks, and that's, you know, that's owned by the government, but we're the taxpayers. And so it's our land. Well, if you believe that the earth is sacred and the earth is alive and that nature is filled with spirits and energies that deserve respect and that we can interact with and that we do interact with in our spirituality and nature, the idea of treating nature like property, that's not actually okay. That's basically sacrilege. And most of us don't think about it. And that's totally okay. It's not some, you don't have to scourge yourself because you weren't thinking about a hiking trail as sacred space. That's okay. But it's something that you should start thinking about when you are going out to play outdoors, that it's not just that public park you've been going to for the last 15 years because it's got the really cool fountain. It's also a space of natural energy and sacredness. When we are going out to go hiking, to go camping, our energies are going to be interacting with those natural spaces. And because we are more aware of those energies, we're probably going to interact more deeply. And so our energies are going to have a much greater impact on the energetic space of the natural areas we go to than someone who is not as aware of it. And it's really approaching nature with the idea that nature is sacred and that we are stewards of the land. We are not owners of the land. And the real difference is there is an owner can do what they want with their property. A steward is there to care for something and preserve it for the future. And those are very different ways of thinking about the land. It's one of those things where it's not some, huge earth-shattering thing, but it's something that most people just don't think about very much. And so I just encourage you to kind of, as you approach planning for going out to play, also think about what that means in terms of your spirituality and metaphysical kind of impacts. Things like leave no trace. Anyone who has ever been part of the Mountaineers or Washington Trails Association or really any outdoor stewardship, nature conservancy, any of those, it's the idea of when you go into nature is to leave only footprints, take only photographs. That's leave no trace, recreating in nature. And it's really about, obviously don't litter because that's rude and bad for the environment. It's don't pollute. Be aware of, when you're walking a trail and there's a mud patch, if you continually walk around a mud patch, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and the trails erode. And erosion can have very negative impacts on landscapes. If you've ever been in any public green space, you've probably seen areas of grass that gets roped off when it rains too much, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest, where mud is our constant companion. But if you keep walking in those roped off spaces that need to regrow the grass because it got too muddy and damaged, that land will not recover. And, we don't think too much about, cutting a corner across, a little parking strip of green. When we do that out in nature, that can have some impacts. When you have trails that are overused that begin to degrade, it can have negative impact on the local wildlife. It can have negative impact on waterways as they get filled with silts, all kinds of things like that. Another thing to think about, and this is something Washington Trails Association just had an article very recently on, is that we have to be more mindful about which trails we choose and when we choose to hike them, because there are certain environments, particularly high desert environments, alpine environments, tundra environments, certain areas of rainforest, where even if you are the most conscientious, leave no trace, hiker, human presence can disturb certain animals in certain mating patterns, migratory patterns, where it can actually, even if all you've done is pass through, can negatively impact the ecology of the area. And as someone who is energetically connected to the earth, the last thing we want to do is to damage it in any way. We're there to appreciate it and to connect. So we have to be very, very conscientious about that sort of thing. And it comes down to just because you can doesn't mean you should. When you're choosing where you're going to go out to play, choose wisely. Choose an area where you're allowed to be. The structures are set up to take care of the earth and the impact that human, recreation has on the earth. I mean, think about like if you go on a boat in the lake, how much gas is being used, how much, oil leakage from old boats into waterways, all that kind of stuff. It can get very, very heavy. So, don't freak out and just not do anything, because that's not real helpful for anybody. But just be mindful. That's really the key, is being extremely mindful and aware, and taking the time to know a little bit more about the areas you're going to make sure that they are being taken care of. Here in Washington State, we have the Mountaineers, the Washington Trails Association, some wonderfully robust park systems that have a huge amount of care. There's lots of volunteers, and, we go, we play, we then clean up after ourselves and become good stewards of the land. Have at it, enjoy it. Places where it's maybe backcountry, where it's maybe more fragile, where there's endangered animals, where there's endangered plants. Those are places where maybe even if we are allowed to go there, perhaps we should not choose to do so. Because if you're someone who is aware of energy, damage to the earth feels awful. If you've ever gone to areas where there's intensive mining, chemical processing, where there's, clear cutting, logging, the earth is wounded. And if you're aware of energy and have any connection to the earth, it's just the worst feeling in the world. And the last thing you want to do is have any kind of contribution to that sort of thing. The earth is sacred and it takes care of us, so we need to take care of it. Kind of along with that is there are lots of outdoor recreations that require specific permits, costs, registrations. Those are not there just to fleece you out of your hard-earned money. Those things are usually fees that directly maintain those areas. Things like park fees go to actually conserving those areas. And so just because you can go into a park with that honor system pay doesn't mean you shouldn't pay them. You want the parks to persist. So if you can, do contribute and, be a good citizen so that future generations will also have these wonderful parks to play in. So that's my soapbox. Thank you for bearing with me. Now I'll get to the fun stuff. So there's a lot of really unique opportunities as a pagan to go out and play in nature and get so much more out of it than just a low stress afternoon. The first one obviously is connecting with the earth. We believe the earth is sacred. Look at these wonderful holidays we have that are all about connecting with natural cycles and energies. Well, if you're going to go out into nature, why wouldn't you try to connect with that energy more deeply? If you're going to go out and spend time camping, you're literally laying on the earth and absorbing the energies while you sleep. When you're out in the woods, you are literally bathing in the forest. There's many cultures around the world that actually have forest bathing as a thing. It's all about interacting with the energies of nature and allowing kind of natural energy flows to essentially purify all of the residue of kind of modern life and all of the stresses where, the trees don't care when your expense report is due, or if you need to get that project charter to your boss. It's a tree. It's there yesterday. It's going to be there tomorrow. And you can spend time in that energy and let it really heal a huge amount of the stress that we have from kind of the artificiality of modern life. One of the whole reasons for paganism as a movement is reconnecting with the earth. And so when we go out to play in nature, we should also be connecting with that bit of nature. And it really does enhance the experience, at least in my opinion. So things you can do to enhance your experience as a pagan out in nature. The first one is, know the history of the land you're going to. I'm a big fan of going to like haunted trails, like places that go to like ghost towns and places where accidents happened, where there's like Wellington up by Stevens Pass, where there was that huge train derailment, because I find that type of energy quite fascinating, and ghosts are kind of my thing. But there's all kinds of wonderful lime kiln trail, very close to Seattle, where there are spirits in these trails. Know if you've gone any of the hiking around Mount St. Helens, the energy there is very, very specific due to the magnitude of trauma that happened to the earth during the Mount St. Helens eruption. But also the regrowth that is happening there is a very specific type of energy. So know the history of what's happened on the land, and you can see, you can connect with those energies, you can appreciate those energies, but it's also a wonderful kind of psychic exercise to see, well, I know this happened here. Do I feel something of that past history? Or do I just feel, well, blackberry bushes are very aggressive? Some trails are like that. Also, being aware of the history of indigenous nations and First Peoples on the lands where we do our recreation is very important. Keeping in mind, for many of us, if we're going to go outside and recreate, we are on stolen land. And that feels really terrible, but it's very important not to pretend it didn't happen. Many local tribes, particularly where certain like popular hiking trails are part of, historical ancestral lands, they will ask people to do things like make a statement of a land acknowledgement before you go and recreate on their ancestral lands. The Snoqualmie tribe, which is, ancestrally all of the Issaquah Alps and Mount Zion, those super, super popular hiking trails were all on Snoqualmie land. They have the Snoqualmie tribe ancestral lands movements. And I'll put a link in the chat at the end of the talk. They have some very specific thoughts and opinions about people over recreating and causing ecological degradation in their ancestral lands. So being aware of things like that just will make your experience more positive for the land than if you aren't aware of it. And doing something like making a land acknowledgement, it's usually just a kind of like 2 or 3 sentence statement, just saying, oh, Fern has just posted it in the chat. Thanks, Fern. It's just a few sentences basically saying that you acknowledge that you are on someone else's ancestral lands and they deserve kind of your appreciation for the history there. And that can also help you to understand the energies that are prevalent in natural environments and connect with them more effectively. Because something like if there was a native massacre on certain land and you're camping there, if you're aware of energies, you might feel echoes of that. You may or may not be welcome depending on who you are. My background is I'm Latin American and very recent immigrant family to this country. And for a very long time, local Native American spirits did not really appreciate me. So I chose not to push my luck, and I would just go to other places where I didn't feel like they didn't want me, because I respect that. You're not going to be welcome everywhere, and that's okay. Taking the time to, when you're going to a new place, to ask permission. We are people that can speak to the earth. So we should ask the earth, hey, is it okay if I do this? Is there somewhere else where you'd prefer I go? it's a very small, simple step. And it's something you don't even have to like travel. You can, pull out your tarot cards, do some divination. Hey, I want to do this. Is it a good idea? We don't know what we don't know, but taking the time to ask permission is a huge, huge improvement than as opposed to showing up and hoping for the best. Doing small things like making offerings for the land. I come from a culture where we do a lot of things with like cacao and corn masa and plantains. And so I will bring things like corn masa or sometimes bird seed as just small offerings as I begin a hike, just to acknowledge that the land is giving me a gift by allowing me to spend time there and to connect with those energies. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be a formal ritual. It doesn't have to be something that's going to get you like weird looks from other people that are in the area. But taking a few minutes to just acknowledge where you are, to be grateful for being able to be there, and being open to that kind of thing can really make a big difference. And some of our trails that we go, if you're going on Mount Si or Mailbox Peak, or you're going to those really intense hikes, that is full body workout for hours. There's a limit to kind of how much mindful spirituality you can have while under extreme physical exertion. So taking those moments at the beginning and then again at the end, knowing that you are not going to be super paying attention to the will of the earth as you are huffing and puffing and trying to come up a rock face. Also be compassionate with yourself. Know your limits and what's comfortable and safe for you. But yeah, ask permission, be grateful. And when you're finished, say thank you. Make sure you've cleaned up after yourself. These are all kind of ways we can take advantage of what we know about connecting with energy from our spiritual practice and bring it very concretely into our recreational activities to really enhance them and to kind of break down that wall between the spiritual and the mundane. Because when you're out in nature, there's no reason for it to be 100% mundane, unless that's what you want. And obviously that's your choice. But I would say that you're going to have a more enriched experience if you can have them blend together. So when you're out and about in nature, when you're not doing Mailbox Peak and you do have a little bit more kind of mental bandwidth to think about what's happening around you other than one foot in front of the other, we interact with things like plants and animals and natural features and spirits and entities. And that's something that we have to also pay attention to. And I see Lene has joined us. One of the things that she brought up in her wonderful talk earlier about alternatives to sage in smoke cleansing ceremonies is the idea of when you're out and about in nature, out and about in a hike, you can do things like wildcrafting. You can collect certain plants and other things sustainably, mindfully, and use those as spell components, use it for smoke cleansing, use it as ingredients in other workings that we do. And that's something that I find very, very enriching. Obviously, we have to be extremely aware of certain plants are illegal to harvest. If you are not someone who knows much about plant identification, there are plants that can severely harm you. They are poisonous on contact, poisonous to ingest. If you touch them and don't wash your hands, you can get sick. Being extremely mindful of what it is you're harvesting. Like if you're going to go and harvest stinging nettles, have a pair of gloves. Otherwise, you're going to have a very bad day. There are certain plants also that grow very, very slowly that unless you are an expert and you have a permit, certain plants are illegal to harvest, have a permit. Be very, very aware of what you're taking off of public lands. And there is a difference between being in a park, what you're allowed to take home, being in a national park, or just being on like forest land. Um, like national forests, you can often like go mushroom hunting and things like that, and that's allowed. But a lot of times in national parks, those are conservancy areas, and you're not allowed to do that. And just because it is sacred to us does not mean we are exceptions to these rules, because doesn't matter how sacred it is. If you killed an endangered plant, that plant isn't coming back. We're not the exceptions to the rule. Animals, similarly. I love when I'm out in nature and I see, you know, a deer or a fox, or once there was a bear. That was very terrifying. I am very small and they are very big. But if you're out and about in nature, particularly if it's early in the morning, if you're in backcountry, as opposed to like Discovery Park where there's everyone everywhere all the time, this is their home. We are in their house. You don't get to kill that spider on the tree out in nature because it's their house. Being very mindful of what you're doing and how it's affecting the animals. You know, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with hiking where there are small children, because they're screaming and frightening the animals, which is bad, but they're also small children, and that's what small children do. So maybe if you are the parent of young children, be aware of where there are highly sensitive animal populations before you take your small child. And maybe until they're a little bit older, a little bit more mature, stick to places where it's, you know, blue jays and squirrels that are really accustomed to humans, rather than a high alpine area where the endangered marmots might not breed because they got scared. It's a whole thing. And just like plants, there are animal components that may or may not be legal to remove from their natural environments. Things like feathers, scales, shells. Depending on which traditions you practice, there's use for all kinds of animal components. In most of North America, you're not allowed to take feathers and do much of anything with them. The North American Migratory Bird Act is incredibly, incredibly restrictive. Do I have a giant pile of crow feathers that I've picked off the ground in cemeteries? Yes, I do. Is that technically legal? No, technically it's not. But it's not generally going to be enforced unless you're like selling them. So, you know, use your good judgment in your choices. But things like eagle feathers, hawk feathers, endangered bird feathers, they will come down on you if you remove those from a natural environment. There's some very specific exemptions for indigenous peoples and their religious use of certain endangered feathers that are like naturally molting. We don't apply under those exemptions unless you are a registered member of a Native American tribe. You are not the exception to this rule. If you see an eagle feather in the wild, leave it alone. Now, that being said, we are people that speak to animal spirits, and they may sometimes choose to gift us with things. Like I found a bit of coyote tail that I was gifted by one of our local coyotes, and I took that home. Was I supposed to? Probably not. That's a risk I am willing to take responsibility for, should that become a problem. And you, as an adult, get to make those choices for yourself as well. If you find bones, feathers, pieces, respect them as the gifts that they are, and use your judgment about whether or not that's something that you should be removing from that location. When in doubt, do divination. That's what it's for. But be really, really mindful that, you know, particularly if it's something where you know it's restricted, you know an animal is endangered, leave it be. You don't actually need that. And then there's interacting with spirit entities. Things like river spirits, waterfall spirits, tree spirits, elementals. These are things you will find if you are an energetically aware person and you're going out into nature, particularly if you're doing backcountry hiking or very, very early morning hiking. I'm the kind of person, I like to get on the trail the absolute, like the moment of dawn, because I don't like crowds and they drive me nuts. And when there's no other people on the trail, you can experience nature much more deeply than when there's a lot of people around. It's easier to hear and things haven't been scared off. So yeah, being aware and taking the time to really interact with what's around you on a spiritual, magical level can give you a hugely different experience and much more rich experience. With that, there's also all kinds of spell work that you can actually do out in nature that is specifically going to do more. You're going to get more bang for your buck with the spell work if you're out in situ than if you are in your house, connecting as well as you can with the whatever means you can. You know, never devaluing the work that you can do in your house. I do 99% of my work in my house. The things that are particularly potent when you're out in nature are things like journey work, where you are doing work to go across realms, doing things like soul retrievals, going through and going to underworld locations and all of that type of kind of shamanic meditation. Being in nature can really ease the transition, because it kind of, for those of us that live, 9 to 5 kind of modern lives, nature is very special. It's someplace we have to drive to, we have to go out, we have to make an effort. It's almost like a liminal space. And so when we are doing our work that requires that kind of separation from our mundane lives, well, we're already there. Just by the act of having to go out and do something different, it's broken out of our kind of routines and thought patterns, and it makes it much, much easier to connect with those different energies, to change our own energies for journey work. Things like using natural energy currents. Mount St. Helens is a great example. There are all kinds of wonderful areas around there where there are certain very specific natural energies due to the volcanic blast. There are certain places where they were preserved, certain ravines where the blast kind of went over, but inside was unaffected. Those are very specific types of energies, using river energies, using ocean energies, using desert energies. By physically going to those locations, that energy is all around us. Can we tap into it from our living rooms? Of course we can. But gosh, it's easier if we don't have to find it. It's just there. So you're going to just have more at your disposal much more easily when you go to those locations. Grounding and cleansing. There is very little you can do that is more effective for grounding and cleansing than swimming in the ocean. It is the crucible of the earth, and it is the greatest symbol of rebirth across so many different cultures. Going out into nature and just working up a sweat and, laying on with your back against a tree. The amount of grounding that happens just by being there is tremendous. And it's a wonderful, wonderful feeling. Going to places where there are waterfalls, just literally the spray of a waterfall is like mood lifting. It can help deal with depression. It can cleanse energies and negative attachments. It can clear dense energy just by standing next to it. You don't even have to think about it. That sort of power is everywhere in nature. And when you're having a rough time, the last 18 months have been hard for everybody, letting nature take some of that burden and letting that be grounded and neutralized so that it isn't persisting in doing harm, That's not just self-care, that's making things better for pretty much everybody and everyone you interact with, certainly. So grounding and cleansing is something that nature is just, it's a gift. It will just do all the work for you. You just have to be there. Things like release and cord cuttings, doing something like releasing negative energies down a river where they are washed away, quite literally. Doing something where you have some symbol of the past that you literally bury in the roots of a tree to just go into the earth to be neutralized. And you literally like take a trowel and dig it and bury it. Very, very small, simple things where, you know, let nature do what nature does best in the places where it does it on its own. We can do all of these things magically in a million different ways. But if we can make our own lives easier and have a beautiful natural experience at the same time, why not? It's all about getting more bang for your buck. No one's got any time or emotional energy these days. So we kind of do what we can as we can. Let nature help you out. And then things like spirit work. If you are someone who is particularly interested in working with things like dryads, which are tree spirits, river spirits, you know, connecting with rock elementals, you know, all that kind of thing. Well, that's where they live. Can you call upon them in the middle of a city? Of course you can. Is it going to be easier if you go to their house? Well, yes. If you're calling them in the city, it might take a couple tries before the call connects. You go to their house, they're probably home. No, it's, I had a friend that put it really well once where, you know, if you are always calling spirits and deities and energies into your home, like where your altar is, that's like inviting your friend to your house all the time. But if you don't go to them, then you're not going to their house and it becomes an unequal relationship. It's a thing to think about. But in general, if I'm going to work with a nature spirit, I will try to go to a place that is very friendly to that spirit. It's easier to make contact. It's also more respectful. It's just a thing to do. So special considerations for spell work when you are out in nature. These all apply double or even triple if you're in backcountry. But your local park or even your yard also counts for this kind of thing. First off, as I mentioned earlier, ask permission of nature before you do a thing in nature that calls upon those energies. Because nature sometimes will say no. You know, we don't always know what's happening in the natural energy currents. You know, I don't necessarily know if my neighbor has had a fight with his partner and if that energy is then coming over into my area. If you're out in nature, you don't know whether or not, you know, some frat boys had a party the night before and trashed a huge section of the park and the park is angry. You know, it might not be that, you know, the nature spirits have denied me. It might just be that nature's having an off day. It does happen. Or you might be asked, you know, hey, I would like to do this ritual. And you might get an impression that nature wants a little something in return. Maybe they want an offering. Maybe they want you to do park cleanup or trail maintenance. You know, very, very simple things. A lot of times, because I don't like hard labor because it's hard, I'll make donations to things like the Trails Association, Mountaineers, Nature Conservancy, other, you know, organizations I know are doing good works for the area. That's another great way to just show your appreciation and, you know, being a good steward of the land. And then also, you know, just like I was mentioning earlier, take in consideration what lives in that area. You know, are you going to be disturbing the birds? Are you going to be disturbing raccoons? Are the raccoons going to very much be disturbing you by trying to steal your food? Are there bears? Are there pumas? These are things we need to think about. You know, your beautiful hour-long meditation journey in bear country might not necessarily be the best thing to do. You know, one of the main ways we keep ourselves safe from megafauna is having things like bear bells. That it's a big warning that we're there and that they should stay away. If you're sitting silently for an hour or two, you haven't rung that bear bell in a while. There may be bears. And yeah, we don't want to be mauled by a bear. That's not good for anybody. And things like, if you're in a very meditative mindset, maybe you're not watching your feet. Certain trails are dangerous. People die on Mount Rainier often, like a dozen or two a year. That's actually a lot. It doesn't take much if you're out in the wilds for something unfortunate to happen. And that's definitely not what we want. So be very, very mindful of what's happening around you. Is it a safe time and place for you to be doing a particular type of spell work? You're probably not going to be doing like an elaborate candle spell while hiking, but you can totally do that if you're camping overnight. Because you're in one place, usually there's going to be a fire. So if you are sitting silently for many hours, there's a fire, and that helps with the bear problem. Do your research, make sure you know what's in the area. Here in Washington State, we have a wonderful, wonderful trail system. And at the head of every trail, there's usually a big announcement board, and it will say what kind of animals frequent the area. And it will generally highlight if any of them are endangered or protected. Always read the signage at the trailhead. It will help you. We have wonderful books that have all of this information in them about every trail. The Washington Trails Association has all of this stuff online. Very, very easy to be well informed. Now, once you've done your spell work, part of that, leave no trace. Don't leave a bunch of spell components all over the place, because then you're that drunken frat boy in magical form. Don't be that guy. I have definitely been places where it was obvious someone had done some kind of ritual and they really had not done a great job about cleaning up after themselves. To which I would add, apart from the whole morality of clean up after yourself, also, please don't ruin it for the rest of us by bringing attention to us doing pagan things in natural spaces. That's how persecution happens, and we want to avoid that. Fly under the radar, please. Better for everybody, honestly. And the last thing we really need to think about is, if you are going to go out and do intensive magical workings, what type of energetic residue are you leaving behind? If you're going out to do something really intense, you definitely want to have something like a magic circle or other kind of energetic barrier, so that when you do that very intensive work, it's contained. When you're done, you want to be very careful about how you ground, so that you are leaving the space as healthy as it was when you came to it. We don't want to deplete a bunch of This is what happens when I talk for this long. You don't want to deplete a bunch of natural energies without doing something to replenish them. That's where the offering part comes in. When you're done, thank the earth. Give it that cup of water, give it some birdseed, give it that little bit of corn masa or whatever it is that you're doing to give back. We can't just take, we must give back. And that is pretty much everything. So TLDR, be responsible and mindful, and enjoy yourself. Let me put some links in the chat. Fern got a bunch of them, which is awesome. But I've just put in links for the Washington Trails Association. That's WTA.org. That is every bit of hiking information you want for everything. I will definitely get to that question in a moment. The Mountaineers. I grew up in the Mountaineers. Like, my dad was treasurer for the local chapter of the Mountaineers. Everything you could ever need to know about recreating responsibly in nature, at least on a mundane level, they've got it. the Snoqualmie tribe, ancestral lands movement that Fern posted earlier. And then also a website called featherfolio.com that has a really good guide to what is legal versus illegal in terms of gathering feathers. So we've got a question in the chat. How do we face the fact that we are on stolen land without giving into shame? Oh, that's such a good question and so difficult. I tend to address that by making donations or giving service. You know, we say these land acknowledgements, you know, and it's very much a token kind of action. It's what we've been asked to do, so of course we will do it, but it doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't address the roots of the problem. It just brings awareness. So it's really the first step. Doing something like making sure if you're out in a park, make sure you've got an extra bag on you and pick up trash as you see it. If you notice someone who is, you know, acting irresponsibly and doing some damage to the ecology, report them to a ranger so that it can be addressed and have the harm stop. Increasing your own education on the history of the land, and making sure that when you're out with other people, you educate them. You know, like I said, giving donations to, you know, tribal funds, giving donations to Nature Conservancy and other, you know, big 501(c)(3)s. Those are things that we can do as positive actions of kind of harm reduction. The bigger elephant in the room is the terrible things have happened, and we are now benefiting from these terrible things. And that's a huge societal question that I totally don't have an answer for, because I am just one little person. But I tend to address it with okay, here is my little corner of the world. I can do this small action to make it a little bit better. And that's what I try to do every day. Every day, I'm going to do this thing that might be benefiting from colonialism, from genocide, from racism, classism, colorism, all the other isms, which we do every day. Making sure we do something positive for affirmative, either to stop harm or harm reduction. That's really the best most of us can do. You know, focus small, because the big stuff will get super overwhelming and you will get that kind of shamed into inaction. So focus on small steps. Try to just make things a little bit better. And that's kind of what we can do. Great question. So another question has been asked: do you have less protection in nature, thinking of shadow work or journeying into the underworld? I have not ever felt less kind of naturally protected in nature. I'm also someone who has spent a lot of time in nature. I'm very comfortable there. Your personal energies are not going to be weakened by going into nature. If anything, they're likely to be strengthened. Though there are people that I know that are extremely urban in their energies, and they are very much empowered in urban areas, and they would feel a little bit weakened in certain natural areas. So largely no, but there are exceptions to that generalization. Any other questions? Okay.
Emily, thank you so much for joining us this year at Puget Sound Pagan Pride. This was an awesome talk, and I really appreciate everything you're talking about in terms of just respecting the land that we're on, and doing what we can to contribute and also reduce harm. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to share with us before we wrap up the presentation?
Yeah, I do have a couple upcoming events. I do want to address this last minute question that came up. This is
Oh,
a really
sorry.
good one.
Yeah.
No, it's all good.
See that. Yeah.
How have I handled encountering an area where I didn't feel welcome? This has happened a couple of times. There was one time I was actually going up to Mount Rainier, and I literally, like, I paid my money, I got in the gates, was driving up the mountain, and every fiber of my being said, get out. Like the mountain was yelling at me. It was like, nope, not today. And I've been here, 20, 30 times throughout. I grew up here. I go there all the time. It was not the time. And so I just turned around the car and left. I went somewhere else. I think I ended up on Mount St. Helens that day. I am very much if I feel like I don't belong somewhere, there are other places I can go. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have something like 900 trails just on this side of the mountain. I don't need that specific one. I can go somewhere else. Chances are I can go 5 minutes to somewhere else. No, that's a great question. I have had things like, if you've like made like a whole excursion, like you're going to do like a camping trip and you've got reservations and you've traveled and you get there and it feels wrong, turning around is going to suck. But sometimes that's the thing to do. So great question. The announcement that I would have for those that are in the Seattle area, on October 9th, which is a Saturday, I'm going to be doing a cemetery walk in Lakeview Cemetery, talking about cemetery magic. It's very, very fun. Feel free, you can, I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat for those that don't have it. My email is emily@e-carlin.com. You can always email these things. So yeah, October 9th is a cemetery walk. And then on October 23rd, I'm doing an online workshop on pop culture magic. So I would invite people to attend that. Should be a lot of fun. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. I hope you have a great day, and I hope that you and everyone else can join us for the rest of the presentations today. Great. So hang on, this is going to be the robotic stopping the recording again.